Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Gruniger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Gruniger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to begin by thanking the sponsor of today's podcast, the Gloucester History Festival. The Gloucester History Festival invites you to join 100 of Britain's top historians, actors, comedians and broadcasters in a mouth-watering programme of events this September. The 50 Blackfriars talks take place in the magical setting of Blackfriars Priory and will be live-streamed for you to enjoy wherever you are in the world. Watch in person or online to hear from Philippa Gregory, Alison Weir, Nathan Amin, Linda Porter, David Olusoga, Dan Jones, Greg Jenner, William Dalrymple, Yanina Ramirez, Kate Williams and more world-class speakers who'll be sharing their love of history in Gloucester. Livestream event tickets give you access to your events until the 27th of September. Book now at gloucesterhistoryfestival.co.uk. The festival runs from the 7th to the 22nd of September. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon, and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means the world to me. If you love the podcast, please consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon family. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Linda Porter back to the podcast to speak about her new book, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. Dr. Porter is an historian, writer, broadcaster, and royal expert. She's the author of 5 books on the Tudors and Stuarts, reviews regularly for the Literary Review and major newspapers, and has done numerous podcasts. Her recent television work includes commentating on the coronation of King Charles III, Susanna Lipscomb's Royal Scandals series, and BBC One's Who Do You Think You Are?, talking to Andrew Lloyd Webber about his formidable ancestress, the Duchess of Suffolk. Her latest book, The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor, was published in June 2024. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Linda. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Natalie. I've been enjoying a bit of long missing British summer over here, and I've been going down to various tennis tournaments, which is quite fun to do and gets you out into the open air at any rate.
Absolutely. That sounds really lovely. And excitingly, we're here to talk about your new book on Margaret Tudor, which I cannot wait to receive, but being down under, I have to wait a little bit longer than other people. So it's called The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. So do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about this book?
Yes. I mean, just very briefly on how I came to write it, because as I think you and other authors will recognise, its trajectory was perhaps, well, not unusual, but to be truthful, it wasn't the book I had wanted to write originally. When Mistresses came out at the height of lockdown and was, as far as I was concerned, a very unexpected success, I had wanted to move on even from the Stuarts into the 18th century, which was where I came from originally as a writer and historian, and to write a book about the last year of Marie Antoinette's life. And I did a very detailed proposal. And my agent, who I have to say has a good feel for this kind of thing, sort of hummed and hawed over it. And he wasn't quite sure about it, which set some alarm bells ringing. And eventually nobody wanted it. There was some interest in the US, but they wanted me to write a sample chapter, to which I responded, I haven't written 5 books to be writing a sample chapter for you, so get lost, basically. And so it didn't go anywhere. And in the end, I thought, well, I'm not sure, this is a very positive frame of mind. And I'd always been interested in Margaret Tudor since Crown of Thistles, which of course came out in 2013. So it's quite a long time ago now. And I had, as we all do when we do research, I had a lot of extra material. Margaret was in that book, but she wasn't the major focus of it, though she did appear, on its timeline from time to time. And so I thought, well, she is Henry VIII's older sister. Her importance in Anglo-Scottish relations and indeed in wider, therefore, European diplomacy isn't adequately understood or explained. She's really not been written about very much in anything of any quality at all. And where she has been written about, she's been universally dismissed and derided. A doctoral thesis came out back in about 2018 or so, I think, from a very fine young scholar, Dr. Helen Newsom, who's actually a linguist and who looked at Margaret's letters, from a linguistic perspective initially, and found in them, a very different woman to the one that's more or less dismissed in half a sentence or so as someone who was only interested in jewels and clothing, which nobody seems to recognize is actually quite an important part of queenship, but it is. And I thought that, no, this was very useful and interesting and perhaps needed to be reflected back to a wider audience. And it did form, an integral part of the research for my book, because Margaret left more letters than any other Tudor monarch. And certainly all of the other Tudor queens put together. I mean, there are literally hundreds of them. She was an inveterate letter writer. I mean, obviously, some are of perhaps more interest than others, but she was. And of course, the letters start from quite early in her life to right up towards the end of it. So you do get a complete picture of this woman and what she went through from being a girl of 13, married in a strange country where they sort of spoke the language, but not precisely the same, to a respected dowager queen in Scotland, trying desperately to help her son and second daughter-in-law through a very harrowing time of their lives. So that's how I came to write it. I thought I had sufficient material. As is often the case, I was perhaps overconfident. I thought, well, perhaps this should be fairly straightforward. It wasn't that straightforward to write. Nothing is. But that is how I came to write it. And I thought she was a neglected and overlooked figure compared with many of the other Tudors, and that she provides a further dimension, and it's not a flattering one, about Henry VIII, with whom she had this almost lifelong sibling rivalry. So, I mean, she is an interesting person. She's not always a likable figure, I don't think, but when you think about it, Natalie, which of these major Tudor figures was? I'm always amazed by these perhaps slightly naive people who say, oh, I would love to have sat down and had a chat with her. Well, you must be braver than me, is all I can say, because I don't think they were the sort of people you actually ever got to know on a personal basis. Even, these queens, as you well know, had all of their ladies in waiting in that. And these are sometimes represented as close friendships. And they were obviously close, but I don't think queens had friends. They had servants to whom they were very, very close. But it's not the same thing. And that would certainly have applied to Margaret, I think.
And they're such interesting observations. And you've just reminded me of something that Professor Eric Ives once said about Anne Boleyn. It was something like, this isn't exact, but it was something like she was more a person to respect than to like,
Yes.
And
Yes.
and I agree with you. Very difficult to know any of these people. But I have to say, Linda, I'm a bit jealous with your subject having left hundreds of letters when Anne Boleyn left 7. So
Yes. And just as a slight aside, I mean, we could get to that a bit later on, but I tried to find out more about Margaret's relationship with Anne Boleyn, because it seems to have been a very positive and friendly one from the little that we can pick up about it, for reasons that we can perhaps go into a bit later on in this. I think after Flodden, the relationship between Catherine of Aragon and Margaret must always have been quite a tense one, even though Margaret spent a year in London between 1516 and 17, in which she would have spent quite a lot of time with her sister-in-law. But, you know, whether you can quite warm to a woman who has said to your brother that she'd like to have sent you your husband's body, but all she'd managed to do was his bloody surcoat, which he'd worn over his armour. I would personally find that difficult. And unlike Princess Mary Tudor, the younger sister, Margaret seems to have accepted the second marriage to Anne Boleyn. We know that they exchanged gifts, because there are references to this. And we tried to find out, Sean Cunningham worked with me on this at the National Archives. We tried to find out what those might have been and a bit more about it, but the warrant books for those years are missing. So we really didn't get any farther with it at all, which was quite disappointing. But as you know, it's what happens in historical research quite often. But yes, I mean, I agree with Eric Kives. And I think one of the disservices that has been done, possibly to Anne Boleyn and certainly other people from this period, is the modern sort of 20th, 21st century view that they're just like us. And wouldn't it be fun to get to know them? But they're not just like us. This is Disneyfication of the past. But that doesn't make them any less interesting. Of course. In fact, in some respects, I think it makes them more interesting. But I mean, should I give just a very brief overview of Margaret's early life?
Yes,
and then
that
we
would
can go on.
I think that would be really helpful. And then we can talk more about the relationships, which is so interesting.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one of the things which I think is often overlooked is that Margaret was the first Tudor princess. She was the first princess of the new dynasty, born towards the end of the year 1489. So she's about 18 months older than Henry VIII. And there'd been quite a gap between Prince Arthur, who was born in 1486, and Margaret. And we don't know whether this is simply because Elizabeth of York didn't conceive during that time, which seems a bit unusual because she seemed conceived fairly regularly after Margaret. Whether there were miscarriages or stillbirths or something, we just don't know that. But there is a gap between the first two children, and Margaret was the first Tudor princess, and of course destined from the cradle, therefore, to make an advantageous diplomatic and dynastic marriage. And she grew up in the pleasant, healthful airs of what is now southeast London, where the airs probably aren't so healthful anymore, in Richmond and Eltham Palaces in the royal nursery there, with her younger brother Henry VIII, and then a succession of siblings, some only of whom, of course, Mary eventually survived. But it would have been an extraordinarily privileged and pleasant childhood. I suppose from the moment almost that you could begin to understand these things, she would have realised that she wasn't going to stay there much beyond childhood. But she was well educated with Henry VIII and her younger siblings. And she seems to have seen quite a lot of her mother, Elizabeth of York, perhaps obviously for political reasons of state, less so of her father. But they were very affectionate parents. Some of the Warren books do survive, which show Henry giving permission for clothing and toys and entertainments and things of that sort. So they were affectionate parents who seem to have been greatly loved by their children. And then all of this comes, I wouldn't say to a shuddering halt, because especially as she got to be beyond the age of 10, she would have realised it. But by the time she was 12 years old, she was betrothed after lengthy negotiations to James IV of Scotland. There were other marriages considered, but this was the one I think that Henry VII always favoured, because Scotland was always a problem. There was constant border warfare and ill feeling. James IV, who was considerably older than Margaret, he was about 30 when they married, she was 13, had been a thorn in Henry's side for a good many years, and had, people probably know, supported Perkin Warbeck, probably with a fair amount of cynicism, because I don't suppose he ever really exercised his mind too much as to whether Perkin was genuine or not. He just happened to be convenient to annoy Henry VII. But I think both the English and the Scots thought by the turn of the 15th, 16th century that it was time to end this. And Margaret was to be the person, the vehicle, if you like, who would, at least for a time, bring these two together, these two countries. So she was betrothed at Richmond at the beginning of 1502, not long after her brother Arthur's wedding, in fact, and was always intended to spend at least a year beyond that in England, essentially being trained by her mother for queenship and what it meant to be the head of a queen's household, how you managed and recruited servants, how you dealt with them, what your role was, all this kind of thing. So she did. And grandmother, Margaret Beaufort, of whom she was very fond as well, also played a part in this. So she had a good training for this. But this was all thrown into disarray when Elizabeth of York died, of course, in February 1503, giving birth to her last child with Henry VII. Margaret had been intended to go to Scotland in the May. She'd been, she'd had a proxy marriage when the Patrick Bothwell, the Earl of Hebburn, who was a relative of a more famous Bothwell later on, I think he was his great uncle actually, came south, and he was the proxy bridegroom. Although in one of these infuriating things which all historians will recognize, I don't think perhaps our readers give us quite enough slack on this. I know I have read somewhere that there was a comment made, probably by a foreign ambassador, that Henry VIII resented his elder sister when she became Queen of Scots, as she did after the proxy wedding, because she took precedence over him for that period of time, because she was a queen and he was a prince. But I cannot find where I've seen this.
Yeah.
But I know I haven't made it up. But anyhow, this seems to have been the beginning of what was to become a lifelong rivalry, sibling rivalry, a deeply unpleasant one in many respects, and one which Henry VIII, in true Henry VIII fashion, managed to take beyond poor Margaret's grave when he disinherited completely in his will her line from the succession. Of course, he was unsuccessful in the end, and it was Margaret's line that succeeded, with which I finished the book, and I've always been rather pleased about this. I'm sure Henry would have been infuriated, but it is what happened. But anyhow, that's the beginning of Margaret's life. And I think the contrast between this highly privileged, interesting, stimulating, but quiet childhood on the fringes of the court. The children came to court, as you know, for state occasions, big occasions. But beyond that, the other children stayed well away. And the contrast with this major progress, which she undertook, is probably the greatest of the 16th century, but because it happened in 1503 to this woman who isn't very well known, it tends to get overlooked in comparison with Henry VIII's and Elizabeth I's progresses. But Henry VII used his daughter as the visible sign of the success and, now the durability of his dynasty. And she made this very long trek. I mean, she left the Palace of Richmond towards the end of June, and her grandmother's home, which is in what's now the East Midlands, Northamptonshire, right on the Lincolnshire border, in July, to undertake a progress of more than 3 weeks, because it was in early August before she crossed the border into Scotland, with a huge train of people under the extremely demanding and infuriating, as far as Margaret was concerned, control of the Earl of Surrey, who'd been on the wrong side during the Wars of the Roses, but who'd sort of earned his return to favour subsequently. And Henry VII entrusted him with getting his daughter to her bridegroom in Edinburgh. And that was how Surrey saw it. I mean, the fact that she was a 13-year-old girl was something he probably found a bit of an irritant, I think. And he was rude both to her and to her servants, which caused a great deal of distress. But he was in charge of this great train of carts, all piled up with beds, bedding, clothing, everything that people moved around with. And one of the people in the train was a diplomatist, then not very well known, called Sir Thomas Boleyn.
I like that.
So yes, I like it too. So he went north with Margaret at that time, and they went through all of the major cities of the East Midlands and the north of England, Margaret made splendid, very stage managed, of course, entrances into cities like, especially York and Durham, the great cathedral cities. But everywhere she went, there were local dignitaries all dressed up in their finery, despite it being the height of summer. I mean, the velvets must have caused you to nearly pass out, I should think. But you had to wear it because it showed that you could afford it. And everywhere she stopped, sometimes she rode in on her white palfrey. Others she was taken in this highly decorated litter that she was carried in. But she always had to be dressed again, change clothing, have her makeup put on and finalized and all this sort of thing. So it's a bit like being a modern celebrity, really. Only she was only 13. And she seems to have been, she grew into a rather overweight woman through childbearing, as her mother had done before her. But she seems to have been a slim and rather small girl for her age. It was one of the reasons they'd waited. I mean, people nowadays are horrified by the fact that you can be married at 12 or 13, but it wasn't that uncommon amongst royal and aristocratic women. It was far less common amongst, the lower orders. But she had to be the face of her father's monarchy and how successful it had been. And I think to carry this off, especially when you've got a rather awkward relationship with the man who's in charge of the overall thing, must have been quite a feat. And eventually, of course, she crossed the border at Lammerton Kirk into Scotland, where she was met by the full Scottish nobility, all appropriately arrayed. And there was lots of wine flowing in various places. And she went initially to Dalkeith Castle to kind of settle in there, where in one of these, again, stage managed and wonderful sort of events, if you like, of the period, James IV met her for the first time at Dalkeith Castle because he happened to be out hunting in the area. Now, it's true that he was fully arrayed in silks, velvets, and carried a lyre, the stringed instrument, over his shoulder, which is something you'd normally take hunting, I don't think.
Very romantic.
Romantic. Well, that was the whole point, of course. And this had been very carefully worked out in advance. It wasn't spontaneous at all. But that's how they met for the first time, with great, bows and curtsies. And James did guide Margaret through all the ceremonies. He kept her very close to him physically, which she wouldn't have been used to, of course. But I mean, he was her husband technically, and they were about to be married formally. What she may or may not have known about him, because he was an extraordinary man. He's one of my favourite monarch of the period, James IV, was that he was an inveterate womanizer. He'd had already 4 or 5, I'm trying to think, 2 with Janet Kennedy. So 4 or 5 at least illegitimate children by various mistresses. And Janet Kennedy, his current mistress, was pregnant with their 3rd child at the time of his marriage to Margaret. And several of these bairns, as they were known, were living in Margaret's Dow Castle of Stirling Castle, were removed subsequently. Then they did go back again from time to time. How much she knew about James's past, we simply don't know. I think it's naive to assume she knew nothing, because one of the roles of ladies in waiting, even if they weren't your bosom pal necessarily, was to kind of, in a tactful way, fill you in on this kind of thing, and certainly of what might happen on the wedding night. And clearly they seem to have done a good job of this. The reason we know so much about this journey north and who participated and what they wore and what the entertainments were was that Margaret was accompanied by a man called John Young, the Somerset Herald, and he recorded all of this, and we have this still, the original document of it, and it's a marvelous record of something that is so far out of the past but which comes across so colourfully. And I've tried to sort of give a flavour of this in the book, so that, because you can sometimes, if you read it, almost feel that you are there with him watching it. He, of course, is interested in it from a perspective of spectacle above everything else, but then that's quite often what we're interested in. He doesn't go into personal details of, at this point the princess looked worn out and bad-tempered or anything. I mean, he would have been too respectful to do that anyhow. But it is a fantastic record. And at the end of all of this, Margaret and James were married on August the 8th, 1503 in Holyrood Abbey, remains of which can still be seen in this glittering ceremony. And again, we know what they wore, which we don't know what Henry VIII and any of his wives wore at their weddings. There are no records of this. But Margaret, who had to wait for James rather than the other way round now, the bridegroom waiting for the bride, because he was the king after all. She was wearing white satin, and so was he. And they must have, I think, looked very resplendent, all of this. She was crowned immediately after the marriage. She was crowned as Queen of Scots with a gold crown that had been specially made for the occasion. And so she became the first Queen Consort in residence in Scotland since the death of Margaret of Denmark back in 1486. So there'd been quite a gap. And James trained her admirably, I think, to fulfill the role of Queen Consort and to prepare her for regency in the, what he would have thought was unlikely event of this coming to pass. And the first 10 years of her time in Scotland, probably following on from her time in England, must really, I think, have been very pleasant and stimulating on the one hand. On the other, she and James, rather like Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, who weren't married, of course, until another 6 years or so later, lost child after child. James, obviously showing what was both common sense and reasonable restraint at the time, didn't actually get her pregnant until she was 16. So she produced her first child at the age of 17, just over 17, and it was a prince. So there was great rejoicing. We have in the treasurer's accounts records of, his cradle, how it looked, the ribbons that decorated it, the people who were hired as washers and laundresses and rockers and that sort of thing. And even a little red scarlet satin coat, which was ordered for him. But very sadly, he died when he was just about 1 year old. So, that there is this kind of ongoing rivalry between Margaret and her brother as to who shall produce the first living child. And of course, Margaret did get there first in 1512 when she finally produced the child who would become James V, who survived. Henry and Catherine of Aragon didn't produce a child that survived until 1516, of course, with Mary. And then, of course, it was a girl. By that time, of course, by 1516, James IV was dead. He very tragically died at the Battle of Floden when he invaded England, perhaps unwisely, though there were reasons for it, and he had a huge amount of support in Scotland. Flodden is one of still the least known battles, and it's a very important one, and you can still visit the battlefield, which is an amazing thing to do. I mean, it lies in farming country in the extreme northeast of Northumberland, so the extreme northeast of England, just about 6 miles from Coldstream, which is the border with Scotland. And anyone who can go there should. It's a bit of a schlep uphill to where James's army arrayed itself at the top, but it is well worth doing. And there's just a hint at the bottom of the dampness and the bogginess, which was what undid James and his troops at Flodden, and they were eventually lured down by Surrey. It was again the Earl of Surrey. He bride, and he brought him his death in the end. They were lured down into this, and there was the most terrible slaughter there. And eventually James was cut off with a small band around him and was probably killed by the English bill, which is a hedging implement, but very deadly in close quarter fighting, much more so than the pike, which is long and unwieldy. And I mean, I've now written about Flodden twice, and I've said on other things, I'm not a weepy historian. I'm not one of these who's always, bursting into tears at the fates of these people, but it is very hard to write about it and not feel to some degree emotional, I think. And it left Margaret a widow with a 17-month-old son at the age of 23.
That's a very difficult situation. Before we move on to talk about the sort of next part of Margaret's life without James, I'm just curious to know what it is about James IV that you so admire, obviously.
Well, I think he was perhaps, he was certainly the last great king of medieval Scotland. And he was a true Renaissance prince. I mean, he was a polymath who spoke umpteen languages, French, Latin, Spanish, Italian. I suppose you have to be careful when you talk about Scots. English people still describe it as a dialect. Most people, I think, now recognize it as a separate language. There are some similarities, but there are also quite a lot of differences. So he spoke a good many languages. He was very interested in what we'd almost call the latest technological developments. He built up his army and his navy, particularly his navy. He didn't visit Leith and probably not even see the sea until he became king at the tender age of 15 in revolt against his own father, which is an interesting aside as well. And he was so fascinated by it that he really concentrated a lot on building up his navy. And one of his first ships he named after his wife, the Margaret. But he was also very interested in the latest, army military type developments and ideas. He was interested in dentistry. He had a lot of doctors at his court. I think unwary nobles might have found themselves having teeth pulled by James, which would probably not have been the most indicative. Margaret managed to avoid that as far as we know. Perhaps her teeth were quite sound, who knows? But he was respected for it was a small court, but it was a true Renaissance court, and in its own way, very sort of glittering and prestigious. And it was the focus of allowing him to bring his often feuding and warring nobility together, because they wanted to go there to be seen and to get favours from the king. And he seems to have been, the portraits of him that survive are late 16th century copies, but it's an intelligent and arresting face, I think, and not precisely handsome, though he's sort of perfectly acceptable. But I just think he's a very, very interesting man, and his desire to put Scotland on the map of Europe, which of course brought him into conflict with his younger brother-in-law anyhow. I mean, it would do on a political as well as a personal level, but there is a lot of personal rivalry involved in this. I think because he is a sort of larger than life figure, he also managed to bring the more distant Highlands part, the Isles, under his control as well. He could be pretty ruthless, James IV, when it suited him, and he needed to be. And he was, like Margaret, at least openly pious. I don't think either of them were hugely religious, but that doesn't mean that religion didn't mean anything to them. They certainly observed it. And James went on pilgrimage quite a lot, often on foot, traveling huge distances. And he was also a very visible king. And this is something that runs right through the Stuarts, even into, when they come down into England 100 years or so later on. Unlike Henry VIII, who wasn't seen very often by his subject, and who certainly would have had a horror of being approached or touched by them in any respect, the Stuarts went out and about, and the people could see them and sort of touch the hem of their clothing and all that sort of thing. James he dispensed justice himself in some of the travelling courts of the kingdom, and he wanted Margaret to be visible as well. One of the first things he did after their marriage was to take her on an extensive tour of southern and southwestern Scotland. So she imbibed some of this as a necessary part of queenship herself. So I think, and it's also the manner of his death, which is incredibly tragic. I think the last British king to die on British soil, and it had a profound impact on Scotland, of course, and on poor Margaret.
I know. So let's talk a little bit about what happens to young Margaret with a young child following James's death. And maybe you can tell us about some of the other matches that she makes as well.
Yes. Well, James had left in his will, he'd left Margaret as regent, or actually the phrase he uses is a Latin one, tutrix, for their son. And what probable, certainly James wouldn't have known. And Margaret might have known by Flodden itself, but not by the time of their farewell, which took place at Linlithgow Castle before he took his forces south, was that she was pregnant with what would be, of course, the last of their child, who was born posthumously, Alexander, Duke of Ross. So not only was she left with a country that might well be invaded, but wasn't, because Surrey didn't have the forces and didn't want to hang around. He resented having to go to Scotland at all. He'd much rather have been in France, where Henry VIII was fighting this sort of silly little war as part of the league that he'd formed with Ferdinand and other anti-French rulers in Europe. But, in Edinburgh, there was considerable misgiving. The news of Flodden was known there probably by the evening of the day after the battle took place. One of the first things she did was to take her little son from Linlithgow to Stirling, which was a more defensible castle. She had to do this in the early stages of pregnancy. She'd been left as regent, and of course much of the flower of Scottish nobility had died with James, that terrible muddy morass at the foot of Brankston Ridge. And so she had to advise her, either elderly, really elderly, but obviously experienced people, mostly in the, most politicians and diplomats in those days held religious offices. So she had that. And she also had, of course, a group of totally unexperienced young men who, for whatever reason, had not been at Flodden. But there was just the extraordinary aftermath of this, not just this great defeat, but also the loss of so many leading men who could have guided this young woman through the next sort of year or so. But the one condition, of course, of James leaving his wife in this position was that she was not to remarry. I think for two reasons. Firstly, that he foresaw that if she remarried a Scottish noble, there would inevitably be factional problems. It wouldn't have mattered at all who it was. It would simply have annoyed and others, all the rest of them, sufficiently to cause trouble. Of course, if she married, as her sister Mary was about to do, outside her own kingdom, then she couldn't possibly have governed for her son at all. So there was that restriction. Margaret continued for very nearly a year after Flodden. She gave birth to the Duke of Ross at the very end of April 1514. And in early August of that year, in a secret ceremony, though I've never quite understood how they managed to keep it so quiet, because they went from Stirling to Perth, which is a day's journey on horseback. And I don't see how you can slip out of places without being, some people must have known. But anyhow, she married Archibald Douglas, who was the Earl of Angus, and who, for reasons that we don't know, had not been at Flodden, though I seem to recall that both his father and probably a brother were killed there, but he wasn't there for whatever reason. He was described rather disparagingly and not entirely accurately by an uncle as a young, witless fool. And if you read your historical fiction or even some, older historical books in which Margaret's mentioned, you would imagine that he was some kind of toy boy that she'd taken a fancy to. But actually, they were the same age, as far as we can tell, almost exactly. And they were both widowed within the last year. He had lost his first wife, probably in childbirth, we don't really know. And she had lost her husband. She hadn't, as far as we know, known him at all well, if at all, before this. But the clue to all of this is that on his maternal side, his uncle was the keeper of Stirling Castle. So he would have been a prominent servant, seeing Margaret on a daily basis. What historians now think is that very far from this being a sort of stupid, irrational love match, pressure was probably brought on Margaret by the combined Drummond and Douglas families, who were very powerful at a time when she was very vulnerable, just having given birth to her last child with her husband. And when she clearly was nervous that the Scottish lords, despite what they said, wouldn't support her. And she knew that there had been an early move to contact John Stuart, Duke of Albany, who was born in France and was the first cousin of James IV, who was approached to come over as governor, which was the Scottish term for regent. Francis I wasn't disposed to let him go at that time, so he was quite a prominent soldier, though he did let him go later on. And of course, Henry VIII was dead set against any further French influence in Scotland, but not so dead set against it that he would actually support in any useful way his sister. And after she married Angus, Henry, who, as you well know, Natalie, and your listeners will know, never really considered that women were competent to hold executive power. It's okay. He gave his first and last Catherines, his first and last wives, the role of regents at a time that he was in France. But they were both advised by an entirely male council. And their roles in both cases may have been written up a bit by feminist historians who want to sort of big up how important they were. Possibly time to look at this in the more, not jaundiced eye, but perhaps to stand back from it a little bit. Certainly Margaret felt threatened. There's no doubt about that. The marriage to Angus was a mistake. She might have lost the regency anyhow. Whether she would have held on to the custody of her children, her two sons, we don't know. Now, I think the one thing that her daughter-in-law, Mary of Guise, may have learnt from talking to her mother-in-law about all of this, as she no doubt did, was that you don't need to make a great play for the regency, but by God, you do need to keep the child who is the monarch close to you, because that is your ticket to continued influence and power. And Margaret lost both. We don't know whether Albany would have let her keep her children, but we do know that they were both eventually taken from her. She lost the regency, and she actually had to give up both of the sons outside Stirling Castle, which she did in one of these great Tudor dramatic gestures, which Margaret was very good at. And she handed the keys of the castle to little James V, who was 3 at the time, made her give him the keys to Albany, thus ensuring that, he was viewed as monarch. The marriage to Angus was a disaster. It was a misjudgment, though not perhaps for the reasons that are often given. It somewhat makes me cringe when you read in books that were published in the late 1990s or even the early 2000s that describes the marriage to Angus as one moment of womanly weakness. And that's by a female historian as well. And I really do wish people wouldn't write this kind of rubbish, to be truthful. There were, as I said, reasons for it. And now the view is that pressure was brought to bear on her to marry. But it wasn't just politically disadvantageous, of course. It was a disaster personally. Angus wasn't witless, but he wasn't a very nice person. And he speedily, as soon as he and Margaret were compelled really to part company, in 1515, she escaped from Linlithgow, where she had gone for her lying in, because she was still a Queen of Scots. And she was pregnant by Angus with the one child they had together. Later, Margaret Douglas, who has a life as interesting as her mamma's.
Yes, she does, absolutely.
Every bit. And by that time, Margaret seems felt so threatened by Albany, though Albany was actually a good governor for Scotland when he was there, and he didn't neglect little James V. And when they first, he and Margaret had a strange relationship. When they first met, she was quite charmed by him because of his French manners, and of course she spoke fluent French anyhow. And later she would, although she felt threatened by him in 1515, later they would work together, against Henry VIII, actually. So she did decide to flee from Scotland in the autumn of 1515, and heavily pregnant, travelled down to the border. She went over the border to Berwick-upon-Tweed and was promptly told she had to go back again because she didn't have permission from Henry VIII to enter his kingdom. But finally she was allowed in, and she gave birth to Lady Margaret Douglas in Harbottle Castle, which was more of a sort of border fort, really. I mean, it wasn't a castle like Hever with nice hangings and comfortable beds or anything. And Margaret seems to have been very ill after many of her labours. I mean, she'd lost 4 or 5 children with James IV. After her first birth, she was so ill that they thought she would die, and James IV went on pilgrimage to pray for her recovery. But certainly she was very ill after giving birth to Lady Margaret Douglas, probably because having to ride long distances side saddle while 8.5 months pregnant, which I don't think many of us would wish to do, actually.
No, goodness.
And eventually she moved to Morpeth in Northumberland, which was the more comfortable home of Lord and Lady Dacre, and spent Christmas there. The child did quite well, actually. I always like the notice which she sent out, that she'd given birth to a Christian soul, being a young lady. I don't think Elizabeth I ever thought of Margaret Douglas as being particularly ladylike. It's a nice description. And so, eventually she found herself in London for a year. She hadn't seen her brother since 1503. This by now is the spring of 1516, by April 1516. She stayed there for nearly a year, spending quite a lot of time with her sister Mary, who was, of course, recently widowed as briefly Queen of France, and with Catherine of Aragon. Again, there are pictures, even in, what purports to be academic biographies of Margaret, in which it describes these ladies sort of all happily embroidering together and chuntering about their husbands. But I just find this quite nauseating. And we have no idea what they talked about. Mm-hmm. And I think there probably were sort of certain tensions, but they'd all recently given birth. So I suppose they did have that in common. But eventually, of course, Henry VIII wasn't going to cough up money to support his sister in England. And he seems to have always had this sort of vague feeling that it might help him if she was back in Scotland, but he couldn't quite work out how. And he could never bring himself, neither he nor Wolsey, to acknowledge that any views that Margaret might have of how her role should be developed in Scotland and how the country could best be governed to the benefit of both England and Scotland. This is all a kind of miasma as far as Henry is concerned. And most of the time, all of the time, he sided with Angus, her second husband, against Margaret. By this time, Angus was helping himself to Margaret's rents. He did briefly come over into England with her, but he never went down to London. I think you've got to remember, from Angus's perspective, he is a great landlord in the south of Scotland, and that is where his prime interest lay. And he would do a lot to protect that, including a rapprochement with Albany, John Stuart, if necessary. And that's exactly what happened. Meanwhile, of course, Margaret was strapped for cash. She didn't even have enough to pay her servants. She's viewed as a constant whinger, but she probably had more money than she made out. As you know, the Tudors always claimed that they never had any money. It was a fashionable thing to do. I mean, there's the Duchess of Suffolk writing to William Cecil, complaining about having to look after Lady Mary Seymour, Catherine Parr's, saying, what a very beggar I am. But, these people all had lands and maybe incomes were not that readily available, but they were not as poor as they claimed to be. Margaret was genuinely very strapped for cash because a lot of the monies that should have come from her, she was an extensive landowner, were just being siphoned off by this second husband and eventually by the third husband as well, sadly, because in the divorce didn't come through as far as Margaret knew until the annulment of her marriage to Angus until 1528. And then she remarried. Again, this is someone who's been described as a sort of toy boy, Henry Stuart. If you get the impression that every third person was called Stuart in Scotland, they probably were actually. They were all very, very distantly related. And he'd been a member of her household. His prominence was commented on by some English diplomats before he actually married Margaret. He was about 6 years younger than her, but not, a teenager or anything like that. And from her perspective, it does seem to have been a love match. Very sadly, by the middle of the 1530s, it had broken down and she wanted to divorce him as well. But by that time, James V was very firmly on the throne of Scotland in his own right, having had the most appallingly difficult and challenging minority, perhaps of almost any Scottish king. And he decided that his mother's marital shenanigans had got to cease. He was very fond of her. I think that's something that is often not...
I was going to ask you that. What was their relationship like, given that they spent so much time apart?
Well, actually, it was very good because Margaret does seem to have been an affectionate mother, perhaps more to her boys than her daughter. But of course, she lost custody of Margaret Douglas when Margaret was 12 and never saw her again. But nevertheless, I mean, the entire focus of Margaret's life after James IV's death was to ensure that her son survived and would come to rule, once he attained a majority in his own right. And that was delayed by Angus essentially taking over. He wasn't ever known as regent, but by the time James V was 12, there was a move to introduce a sort of rolling council of people who would take charge of him every 3 months or so, which was a daft idea in itself. And it wouldn't have worked. And who would you think would be the first in this but the Earl of Angus? And after the first 3 months, he just refused to give James up to anyone else. And James hated him with very good reason, I think. But his relationship with his mother, though they were apart from time to time, she made sure that she saw him as much as possible. And that when she did, she was suitably arrayed as a queen. Again, she has been criticized for this, but she wanted her son to see that this was how royalty should depict themselves. And I think she did it very well. They do seem to have been genuinely very fond of each other, even if James did grow somewhat impatient by the outcome of her third marriage, which was as disastrous as the second. And he did use her in diplomacy, as did the Duke of Albany. This is perfectly apparent in all of these letters. When it suited people in Scotland, and Margaret was always very keen to have this role because of the fact that she was damned if she didn't, damned if she didn't. The Scots saw her primarily as a Tudor, I think, which is understandable. She didn't want to be seen that way. She wanted to be seen as the mother of the king. And she did have a brief second regency in 1525, which she lost again because of this sort of rolling circus of who would be in charge of her son, which never really worked at all. But she was still being used in Anglo-Scottish diplomacy in about the year 1534. So she knew a lot of the people and she knew the issues, and she had in her own mind a clear idea of what she wanted to achieve. And we know that she was quite talented at this because she had mastered the various forms of written and oral communication, which has been really highlighted in this wonderful thesis by Helen Newsome. I mean, she sent holograph letters, which would have been in her own handwriting. She sent dictated letters, which would have had possibly a postscript written by her. And she also used the memorial, which is a fascinating form of communication because it's almost like acting. She sent, she had a couple of men whom she relied upon to do this. You sent them down to Henry VIII. You discuss with them beforehand what points you wanted emphasized and how they might put this across. And incidentally, she'd written all of this out in her own handwriting so she could show it to Wolsey and Henry if necessary. And so the deliverer of this message would have to read the signals that he got back from the king or from Wolsey and adapt what he was going to say accordingly. So it's a fascinating form of communication. And Margaret seems to have been very adept at using this as well. So, this is not some silly woman poring over her jewelry box. She has a very good idea of how diplomacy works in the 16th century and how you can make it work for you. So, yes, I mean, the main way that I think she showed her affection to her son was to assure that he would continue in his role as king. And I mean, he was, of course, as a little boy, subject to the sort of infant death that he could have died at any time. And it might have been to the benefit of Angus and people like that if he had done, but he didn't. He survived. He actually had more mistresses and more illegitimate children than his father. But Margaret knew both his wives. I mean, very briefly, she met Madeline of France, who died within 6 weeks of arriving in Scotland, of course. But she knew Mary of Guise much better, because Mary of Guise seems to have encouraged James V to ensure that his mother was more at court than away in her own residences. And in the spring of 1541, when the two little sons of Mary of Guise and James V died within days of each other, I mean, there are all these family tragedies that we kind of take for granted. You know, you see them in the historical record and you assume, oh, well, they must have thought, tough, we'll have another. But there's more and more, I think, evidence of
heartbreaking.
Absolutely heartbroken they were by this. And Margaret spent quite a lot of time comforting them and wrote to her brother about this in some detail. I don't know whether he ever responded or not. Knowing Henry VIII, he probably didn't. But she then, in the autumn of 1541, went back to Meffin Castle, which is just outside Perth. I think it used to be a hotel. I think it may be the sort of place that you can get married in now or something. It's a sort of one of those Scottish tower houses that are quite recognisable if you go up there, where she had a stroke in October of 1541 and lived for a couple of days afterwards, but not long enough for James V, who was at Falkland Palace, which is well to the east, to get to her in time. There was mourning for her in Scotland. You can see that from the wardrobe records, that both her son and daughter-in-law dressed accordingly. We don't know that much about her burial, but it seems to have been, you know, a fairly major occasion of state. Henry VIII didn't observe mourning for his sister at all, as far as we know. He did for various European monarchs at the time, but not for her. And of course, later on in his will that he made in 1547, he cut out her line completely on the grounds that they weren't born in England. Though, of course, interestingly enough, that didn't apply to Lady Margaret Douglas, because she had been born in England, in Northumberland. But she blotted her copybook quite badly in 1536, as we know, by making a rash, at least betrothal, if not secret marriage, to a Howard, which upset Henry very considerably. She survived that, of course. In fact, she survived well into Elizabeth's reign. Margaret was very concerned at that point about what might happen to her daughter. She really seems to have been feared that, given Henry's track record, he might send her to the block as well. And she wrote what for Margaret was an unusually grovelling letter to Henry, you know, begging him to forgive her daughter, blah, 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 and all that sort of thing. But she never did see Margaret after Margaret left Scotland at the age of about 12. Presumably there must have been letters that passed between them, but we don't know of any that survived. But I think it was Henry's last spite against this sister, whom he had always resented, and whom he had deliberately set himself up against and refused to support her when it might have been in his interest to do so, because I think she was a woman and he didn't think that anyone in her position was really to be trusted or given even the benefit of the doubt. Her last, I think, her own resentment against him, which she could give full rein to really very much, was made to Sir Ralph Sadler, Thomas Cromwell's servant, who spent quite a lot of time as a diplomat toing and froing to Scotland, saying that, you know, it would have been but a small thing to have spent a little bit of pen and ink on her. And I think, you know, even a letter from Henry from time to time. And when she did get letters, they were nearly always hectoring and negative. I mean, he was furious about her trying to get a divorce from Angus at a time when he was just starting to begin the annulment from Catherine of Aragon. These double standards are quite extraordinary, I think. It is a major sibling rivalry of the Tudor period. It isn't very well known. And I think it's basically very sad.
Yeah, I agree with you, Linda. And I'm wondering, I have one more question for you. You've been so generous with your time already. But why do you think, given the, you know, it sounds like rich documentary sources about her life, this fascinating story, her position at this, you know, an important position in the politics of the time, why do you think she's been largely not ignored, but perhaps not looked at as often as some of the other Tudor women?
I think because, well, you know, she's not one of the six wives, and she's not Elizabeth I. She's not even Mary I, you know, whom people have only really begun to look at much more seriously in the last 20 or 30 years, or in a completely different way. There has always been this feeling that Tudor England must be more important than Stuart Scotland. Although, of course, the Stuarts have been on the throne for over a century victory before Henry VII set foot on Bosworth Field, and were all right. It was a small country, but it did, because of that, have to turn outward to Europe, where it was much better known and respected. It had a very long-standing relationship with France and also with Scandinavia, because many of the Scottish Queen Consort were from Scandinavia. But I think it's because of the imbalance of the fact that, English history has always taken precedence in this time and still does. And the fact that, Margaret has been depicted as this oversexed whinger, only interested in younger men, clothes and jewels. But a queen who wasn't interested in clothes and jewels might as well have ended up in a nunnery, because, it was the visible side of queenship. And apart from that, of course, Margaret's letters are scattered and many of them are still actually in the British Library, which at the moment would make them very difficult to access because of the ongoing problems there. And also, of course, it's said that Margaret's handwriting, various people have said it's illegible. It isn't actually, but of course you do need to get some familiarity with it. I suppose it's because, despite all Margaret's efforts, not much of her diplomatic activity ever amounted to anything dramatic, that you can look at, like a treaty or, a meeting of monarchs or anything. Yet, of course, in the mid-1530s, before Prince Edward was born, we find Henry sending a missive up to Scotland via a diplomat to remind his sister that her son, may be regarded as the heir of England. But he changed, of course, when Edward VI, future Edward VI, was born, that all changed anyhow. He was aware of the connection. I don't think he ever forgave James V for refusing to meet him in York in 1541. And of course, the Scots didn't want Mary, Queen of Scots, the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, to marry Edward VI either, which was Henry's sort of master plan. I think Margaret would have been delighted to know that her granddaughter was considered. She never, of course, knew her granddaughter. She was dead by that time. But I think she would have been thrilled to think that she might, one day help unite the two crowns, which she did, of course, but not in the way that Henry VIII anticipated. And of course, it is Margaret's descendants who still sit on the throne of the United Kingdom. So in that respect, she and James IV were very successful, but only 100 years after their marriage.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, I'm so looking forward to reading your book, and I'm sure all of our listeners are keen to do the same. So The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor. And Linda, thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the podcast and talk Tudors with us.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, Natalie.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.